Reflections on EU enlargement have taken up a lot of political debate and expert thinking across Europe. Usually, the debate focuses on the extent to which candidate countries are aligned with EU legislation, what technical advances they make in the accession negotiations, and how an enlarged union of more than 30 members would still be able to make decisions. Well, today we will explore EU enlargement from a different angle, looking at people, not just institutions, looking at firms, not just nation-states, and looking also at the security foundations of EU enlargement. My guest is Professor Erik Jones, who has recently written, together with Veronika Engel, several interesting papers that take a fresh look on EU enlargement. Professor Jones is the director of the Robert Schuman Centre of Advanced Studies at the European University Institute in Florence. He has had a distinguished academic career of over 30 years focusing on European integration and international political economy. My name is Mariam Khotenashvili and I'm the executive director of TEPSA. Welcome to EuropeChats and welcome, Erik.
Oh, thank you. It's great to be here.
Erik, in one of your recent papers that you have co-authored with Veronika, you say that the whole process of EU enlargement needs to be reconsidered, as does the process of state transformation upon which it is based. You say that we should better focus on people, firms, and security. Could you please explain our listeners the basics of your thinking?
Okay, so there are two different issues here. One is about enlargement and the other is about state transformation. So I'll do the state transformation piece first, because I think that for most listeners is going to be the most important piece to understand. We have a set of criteria for accession to the European Union that are all focused on institutions. So you go and you look at the institutions and the way the institutions interact, and if it looks increasingly like what you imagine a democracy to be, and there are certain criteria that we establish for that, then you can certify that this is a working democracy, and that's great. The problem is that democracy is not about institutions. Democracy is about people. You can have the best institutional framework in the world, but if the people you elect to run that set of institutions don't want those institutions to work, they're not going to work. And one of the things that we learned in the last round of enlargement, the last big round, the one that took place in the early 2000s, is that many countries that qualified in institutional terms actually began to show undemocratic behavior through individuals. And what we need to do is to figure out a way to capture that in advance, because a lot of the warning signs were already apparent in 2002, 2004. And what we need to do is to figure out how to capture those warning signs if we're going to do it again. This will change fundamentally what it means to be merit-based in the context of this accession process. And why do we want to do that? That's the first part of your question. There are already 27 million people living legally in the European Union from outside the EU. If you imagine those people coming in, that is an enlargement of the European Union. And the question is how best to manage the relationship with those people. We can do it on a state-by-state basis and rely on the member states, but at a certain point, it becomes useful to start thinking about bringing their government in to help deal with that, right? The best illustration of this principle would be the unification of Germany. I mean, at the end of the day, what was the choice that Germans faced? They could try to have two different Germanys, but with so many East Germans moving to the West, it made more sense to bring the five Länder of East Germany into Germany in order to manage this flow of migration. We could make the same argument about firms and the rest, but I don't want to stretch this out too long.
I think what you were saying about democracy being about people and not institutions is extremely true. We have examples from Hungary, from the US, from many other places around the world. But at the same time, if it's about people, how do we make sure that those people don't come to power to undermine the very same democratic institutions? I mean, it's a good observation, I think, but it's also kind of makes it very difficult to defend democracy, right?
Well, I mean, think about it. Think about it the way we look at banks, right? You can have the best designed bank in the world, but if you put people in charge of the bank and they don't want the bank to manage risk efficiently, if they want to manage risk in a crazy way, right? Moral hazard is a technical term for that, in the hopes of getting bailed out, then that bank will, unfortunately, get into trouble. So what we do in the banking system is we stress test banks. to try to understand not just the institutions, but how people might misuse those institutions and what we would need to put into place under different scenarios to make sure that that bad behavior doesn't turn into something disastrous. There's no reason we can't stress test democratic institutions the same way. So rather than looking at them as a static construct, we can just imagine scenarios and see how they develop.
Well, you said that the EU has in a way already enlarged, encompassing millions of people from the Western Balkans and from Ukraine, and there's business done both ways. So the question, according to you, is how to bring this de facto enlargement, right, in the framework of rules and institutions. How is it that easy?
Well, I don't think there's anything easy about it, right? I mean, but I do think that, if you imagine the alternative of not enlarging, how many of the most talented people from the Western Balkans are going to find their way into the European Union? And what is that going to do to the prospects in the Western Balkans for those countries to develop, either economically or politically? If the goal is to have a prosperous Western Balkans within the European Union or within Europe, let's just pretend that we can do this without making them member states. Then we have to figure out some way to make it attractive in the Western Balkans for people to stay. And I think that's going to be easier if they are member states. I mean, the experience of the last 2 decades is not very, let's say, attractive as an alternative. What we need to do is to make the prospect of membership real, bring those countries in, and then help them develop. And if you look at how fast and how impressively the countries of Central and Eastern Europe developed after 2004, you'll see what I mean.
Absolutely. The experience shows that the candidate countries, but also countries that are already part of the European Union, may take an authoritarian turn. How should the EU engage with candidate countries with pro-European population but non-cooperative governments? And how do we maintain the rule of law in an enlarged union? Do we need to change anything in the mechanisms of monitoring and protecting the rule of law?
Mariam, you can tell from my accent, I'm not from around here, right? And in that context, I think we have the same problem dealing with the United States, right? The United States has a perfect democratic constitution that has not been changed for the last 75 years, but we're going into a set of elections that many people think constitute a real threat to the functioning of American democracy. How do we do that? Do we imagine that Americans have somehow turned against democracy? I don't think they have. But I think that there are opportunists in American politics who have. And that's the same problem that you face in the European Union. It's not a problem that goes away because you're a West European country. It's not a problem that goes away because you're a privileged country. It's a problem that we all face. And what the European Union needs to do is to come up with ways to bolster the people who support democracy within these countries. And I would say that in the United States context as well. And the point I would underscore is it's going to be easier to support democracy within the European Union than it's going to be on the European Union's frontiers. So if you look in the Western Balkans and look at what's going on in Serbia, for example, the question that you should ask yourself is, do we have more leverage? Can we offer more support to the people of Serbia inside or outside the European Union? I would argue that the answer is inside. And I would say the same thing for Georgia. A last point, because I know we're going to talk about security later. If you think about our alliances, we have the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, within which a number of countries have shifted from democracy to authoritarianism to democracy to authoritarianism and back again. And we found ways to work with those countries without breaking that alliance apart. So if NATO can do it, then the question is why can't the European Union? I realize that there are many more issues in play. I'm not trying to simplify this, but it's the political will, I think, that is determinant more than the issues themselves.
You said that we should ask ourselves whether we have more leverage in the EU over those uncooperative governments. I mean, that's a very good point. But at the same time, what kind of measures do you imagine in these cases? When I imagine the candidate country government is simply not cooperating with the EU, and the EU has its own rules, its own priorities, and its own mechanisms how to see whether those countries are doing well on their accession track. So what should they do, more concretely in these cases?
So we used to have big non-cooperative governments in the EU all the way from the beginning, right? So if you look at France in the EU in the early 1960s, France was very uncooperative. At one point, it even pulled its representation from the council, right? And the solution was to try to find a new way of working together, Luxembourg Compromise that made possible the arrangement. Now, obviously, the Luxembourg Compromise wasn't great in terms of the efficiency of decision-making, but it did buy time to allow for a political change in France that then made it possible to move forward again. And I think, in these situations, we need to be able to buy time. And the other thing that I think is important is that we may be in situations like we are right now where we don't have time. And there has to be a way to manage that as well. And I'd be happy to talk about what we might do in those situations. But I think it's going to be much more controversial and much more speculative, because one of the things that is clear is that we're still in the 1960s mode of buying time by appeasing these regimes rather than confronting them, and confronting them may be necessary.
Erik, in a very interesting paper that you and Veronica have written on what went wrong in Hungary, you say that, and I quote, EU struggles against its own tendency to support authoritarianism. The EU provides resources to support less than democratic regimes, while at the same time providing an escape route for all those who want to flee authoritarianism. As a result, the EU finds itself in an authoritarian equilibrium or autocracy trap. I really love it. The EU budget does have anti-corruption and anti-fraud control mechanisms, but your point is about the power that EU money brings to national governments. Why hasn't the EU been able to overcome this problem?
So the first thing, I'm an academic, and this is an interview, but I have to put a footnote. Much of what you just said is all stuff I got from my colleague Dan Kellerman in his writings, and so I brought that into my argument, particularly about the autocracy trap. And what Dan argues, and I think it's a really compelling case that he makes, is that there are two different issues at play here. One is you need these countries politically, and since you need them politically, particularly need them politically in making decisions on a party-by-party basis, on a coalitional way, then politicians tend to disregard the bad behavior because they want the support when those decisions are made. And Dan has a particularly strong line of criticism against the European People's Party for having supported Fidesz and Viktor Orban for so many years in that way. The other argument is more about the way the EU distributes financial support. A lot of the financial support that goes from the European Union budget into the member states goes through the central government. And then the question is that really the best way to ensure that the money gets used as efficiently and with the intentions for which it's mandated? My colleague Laszlo Brust argues very forcefully that in fact, by giving the money to central governments, you create the resources for central governments to buy off important parts of civil society and to corrupt the society rather than developing it. So I think we need to address that issue as well, and it's an issue that Dan Kellerman has also raised. So those are two things that we need to worry about: the political cover and the financial cover. I should say again, in any federal arrangement, like in the United States, we have very much the same problems. So it's not something that's unique to Europe. It's something that we can work around. We just have to have the political will. And that's the final point, right? Your question is, what do we really need? We need the political will to address these issues.
Erik, do you observe the same authoritarian equilibrium supported by EU funding also in the Western Balkans? The new growth plan is based on the concept that EU money will flow in exchange for the implementation of agreed reforms. Will this help to reduce the risk that Western Balkans will get stuck in this autocratic trap?
The reality is these are all very complicated situations, and it's a very delicate balance of influence. And when I say that, I think back on the experience of Slovakia in the 1990s, right? I mean, Slovakia initially was held out of privileged status to negotiate for accession because Vladimir Mečiar, the political leader in Slovakia at the time, was viewed as an authoritarian leader and displayed radically authoritarian tendencies. And so the idea was, we're not going to deal with Slovakia until there is a political change. And lo and behold, a political change took place. A very unlikely coalition of support formed to keep Mečiar out of power. And suddenly Slovakia's position in the accession process changed radically, and Slovakia became a candidate like any other. I think that's what the European Union is trying to achieve with this growth pact in the Western Balkans, is trying to create incentives for the opposition to these authoritarian leaders to organize in ways that would replace them, or incentives for these authoritarian leaders to begin to play by the rules of the game. The point about conditionality that you made earlier is important in that regard. Is it going to be 100% successful? No, it's very difficult to do these things. But again, it's far better than the alternative of leaving these countries to their own devices or to the influence of third parties. Here I'm thinking explicitly about Russia and China, but there are other countries that are interested in the region, third parties that have very different designs of influence that they want to introduce.
Oh, perhaps one final question about democracy. Another lesson you draw from the Hungarian case is that for democracy to function, a state should have a basic social consensus in place about the character of the country, and consensus that power is handed over in free and fair elections. Those who lose elections today must always have a fair chance of winning next time, and strong constitutional checks and balances must always be in place. It seems to me, though, that many European countries are currently quite polarized between democratic parties and aspiring authoritarian forces. How can European societies rebuild the sort of basic consensus that would ensure democratic resilience?
So it's really hard. I mean, I don't want to minimize these things. The thing I would say is that in proportional electoral systems, it's harder to get the same degree of polarization that you see in those first past the post electoral systems, or electoral systems that give a very large majority bonus. So we see much more extensive polarization in the United States or in Hungary than we see in Belgium, for example. But even Belgium has its own polarization. If you look at the leading political parties in Belgium, the largest political party is the Vlaams Belang, which is a party that really does not want to work across the linguistic frontier. The challenge is to try to figure out how to restart a conversation. I think strengthening political parties is one way. Bringing more people into the political process is another, encouraging young people to join political parties. But I think we also need to reinforce the norms of democratic behavior. And to be honest, I'm not even sure how we do that. If I were more confident that I knew, I'd probably be back in the United States preaching that as a solution to what ails American politics today.
Erik, if we move to security, so the Big Bang enlargement of 2004 took place in parallel with the enlargement of NATO. Poland, for example, joined NATO 5 years before it joined the European Union. What kind of security foundations do you think are necessary for Ukraine in order to integrate into the European Union and for its reconstruction to happen?
So I think that's an excellent question, because it underscores the difference in the security context between the late 1990s and early 2000s and today. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, the biggest security concern that we had in Europe was internal to countries. It was about political destabilization, civil war, violent conflict among people who lived together. There was a little bit of cross-border ethnic conflict that people worried about on the margins, but mostly it was within countries. So the fact that they were brought into NATO actually was immaterial to the security concern that we were most obsessed with. And if you look at the change in the accession process at the end of the 1990s, it was accelerated precisely to create the political incentives to deal with those internal security threats. Now we have not just internal security threats, but also external threats. It would actually be useful to have NATO come in and eliminate those external security threats. But you know what? It wouldn't be credible. We can have bilateral security guarantees between member state countries in the European Union and these countries on the eastern frontier, but extending Article 5 to these countries would not be credible, because the United States would never buy into this. And by the way, if you look
Why wouldn't it?
Because it's too much of a commitment. and it has too great a risk of escalation. So even if they were rhetorically to say, oh, we're going to extend Article 5 to include Ukraine and Georgia, right? I don't think anybody that is an adversary of the United States would look at the American political process and say, they're going to do whatever it takes, right? They're going to use Article 5. And by the way, the language of Article 5 was drafted specifically to take into account that credibility issue, which is why the language of Article 5, which was drafted in 1949, the language says that each member state of the alliance will use whatever means they deem necessary, right? And that's different from the language of the Brussels Treaty, which, by the way, now gets copied into the Treaty of the European Union. But the 1948 Brussels Treaty said, if an attack on any one member state will be met by all the other member states with all the resources they have available, right? The United States looked at that and said, this is not a credible security guarantee. So this credibility issue is important. How do we make these bilateral European security guarantees credible, not just in the eyes of the Ukrainians and the Georgians and everybody who's under threat, right? But also in the eyes of our adversaries. And that level of credibility is not just a declaration of a pen, right? That level of credibility comes from deep social and economic engagement. The more we are deeply socially and economically and politically engaged with these countries, the more our adversaries will look at that engagement and say, well, wait a minute, if I create mayhem in these countries, that will cause so much damage to the European Union. The Europeans will have to respond, right? And by making ourselves vulnerable, we make ourselves credible in that sense. And in many ways, that's why enlargement has to precede NATO enlargement, because we have to create the conditions for a credible security guarantee first, and then put the formal security guarantee on top of it.
How do you think the EU's enlargement policy factors in the fact that Russia is working determinedly to undermine and derail the enlargement process? Do you think that it's sufficiently acknowledged that enlargement is not just about the efforts of the candidate countries, that it doesn't take place in a vacuum, but that the EU and the candidate countries face an adversary which is very serious about not allowing any meaningful progress?
Oh, yeah. I think we would not be having this conversation right now if Russia had not done the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022. And when Russia did that full-scale invasion of Ukraine, it not only demonstrated, although why we needed that demonstration after 2014 or 2008, right, remains an open question that we might discuss in another forum. But the fact that Russia demonstrated its willingness to be a revanchist power in this way is what has provoked this whole enlargement conversation. It's all about security. It's not about state transformation. State transformation is something that we're trying to accomplish alongside that, and yet it is the security is the goal.
And yet, a lot of discussions about enlargement are in the context of state transformation, right?
Existing member states look at these countries and go, we want to make sure it doesn't cost us more than we gain, right? And they're also looking at these countries and saying, we want to make sure that they're compatible with the rules, norms, and conventions that make the EU operate. I don't think that's an unreasonable request. But the pace of enlargement, we know this time around, will exceed the pace of state transformation, which is why everybody is talking about a staged accession process to try to create more and more formal linkages as the state transformation takes place. My concern is that it wouldn't be for the first time, by the way. My concern is that we will inevitably have to complete the accession process before the state transformation is complete. It's inevitable, right? And by the way, again, not for the first time. The accession of Greece to the European Economic Community took place before its democracy was fully stabilized. I could make the same argument about Portugal and Spain. And when we do these things, we have to understand in the enlargement to Central and Eastern Europe that took place in the early 2000s, that was written into the formula. So Bulgaria and Romania were given a date certain for accession, despite the fact that they weren't even qualified, right? And they were told, well, create these mechanisms for you to achieve that qualification after this date. So I think there's nothing unusual about this, but we have to be ready for it.
That's a good point. We have to be ready for it. And do you think that's, given that unanimity is needed in the Council for further enlargement, do you think that they are ready for it?
I mean, it always comes back down to this political will issue. They have to understand, right? What is the alternative, the viable alternative, right? I mean, I don't think that there is a more attractive alternative than enlargement. And so the issue is not, do we enlarge or not? The issue is, how do we make enlargement a success? And how do we maximize the stability that comes from it? Because if stability is the goal, and it is, then we need to skew all of the procedures and institutions toward that objective, right? And that stability will only arise if the process itself is credible. I've talked about credibility in the eyes of the accession countries or candidate countries and credibility in the eyes of the adversary, but it has to be credible in the eyes of the West Europeans or existing EU member states as well. And so there's a huge communication campaign that needs to get wrapped around this whole process so everybody's on the same page.
Do you personally believe that the EU would or will enlarge in the next 10 years?
I mean, it's already enlarged. This is back to that human focus I mentioned. The question is whether we're going to formalize that by bringing in member state governments. We're already engaged with those governments. We're already building institutional ties. Enlargement is not going to take place as some kind of snap your fingers magic moment in the next 10 years. Enlargement is underway. We just don't call it that because we want to help people better to understand what the end goal looks like. But we're already in the machine, and the machine is going to move as far as it can, and hopefully it will move far enough to stabilize those countries, to push away this external threat, and to help everyone in the European Union live a more peaceful and prosperous life.
Thank you, Erik, so much for this fresh look on enlargement. And thank you all for watching. We will be back with further episodes soon. Stay tuned.